just turn around and leave me. The tear in my eye drops on the floor alongside my spear. My knees are drenching in the blood I spill just to get in. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way. I never pray to God anymore. I'd rather no one hurt me. Redemption, I have waited for you to come and drown all my sins. My knees are drenching in the blood I spill just to get in. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames.
Okay. My mic working?
I
Yes, it
don't
is.
wanna
Alright.
fight
Let us get on
anymore.
with the reading, shall we? Okay. My mic working? Yes, it is. Alright. So, we are on chapter 16, I believe. Yes. Did I mark that right on my... Yep. Okay. On the stream. So, we're on chapter 16 of The Cloven Tree by C.S. Holmquist. Chris Holmquist. We're getting towards the end. A few more chapters to go. So, I'm just curious. I'm going to flip ahead and see. It's not too bad. Not even 20 pages tonight, so that's good. Okay. Chapter 16, Braun and Curtis. Quiet filled the hills before despair was removed from the battle, or after despair was removed from the battle, and for miles all was silent. The orcs in the ravine, the soldiers of the relief party, the defenders on the hill, even Dan's family on the hidden lookout trail had witnessed the destruction of the Hlemiak, and every face was filled with shock, even the legionnaires. The undead captain was looking backwards, and he stared for long moments at the destroyed corpse of the flesh demon. The defenders started to hope again, and many thought the battle would be avoided, for if they could muster that kind of might, who would want to assault them? Braun turned, gazing at Owen, his face unreadable, and the scene held for moments as he studied the fenman, who was gasping at the effort of what he had done. He is deciding to leave, the defender's thought. Soon every one of them believed it. Why is he waiting? Abruptly, the shock passed from the faces of his legionnaires as Bron's smile became feral. He shouted in an ancient tongue, Iliegi volevinesh. The command placed great strain upon him, the defenders saw. His lifeless face was nearly sweating. For good reason, as with his own show of strength, Bronn reincorporated the legionnaires who had been destroyed. Nearly 20 corpses that had been obliterated reformed from dust and ash. The defenders hissed, but Bronn did not stop at that. Scerbidor Nencumane. At that shout, more undead marched from behind the boulders where they had been waiting with despair in reserve. Seconds only it took them to join their fellows, but for the watching defenders it was a march of years that they did not have, a passage of decades that they were now going to be denied. A dread seized them nearly as powerful as the demon's blast, for with the reserve squads of legionnaires, the defenders were less than twice the number of their assailants. Against the undead, that would not be enough. The captains were especially ill at ease, for only one legionnaire was strong enough to revive those corpsemen who had been utterly destroyed, and they knew now who captained these undead. Had Owen the power at that moment, he would have seen a spark of evil expand into a forest fire. Silently, the defenders stared at his flag as his flags were raised, and Bronn revealed himself entirely. Curtis spoke first, only a whisper. 18 squads, he muttered. 11 score of them, or near enough as to make no difference. 7 banners? Wilmer corrected emphatically. 7 banners. Oh, that was a statement, not a question. Do you know what this means? Who this means? I can count, guardsman, Curtis rebuked him, and the younger sergeant twitched at being reprimanded like a recruit. I ain't dumb and I ain't stupid, but the flags themselves ain't going to kill us. We're trapped anyway, so that don't mean blasted not, he said, with stubborn emphasis, refusing even now to return to the hopelessness that for so many years had trapped him in a bottle. Wilmer was stunned at Curtis's unfrightened attitude. The banners to him meant a very great deal. Then he realized what Curtis was saying. The job had to be done. The difficulty of doing it would only get in the way if dwelt upon. Besides, the King's Guard would have to kill Bronn eventually. Why in all hell's not today? Wilmer whispered in iron pessimism. Looking about, they both noticed the defeated looks around them. Even their auxiliaries sensed that something was extraordinarily wrong, but most of the commandos, unblessed by the ignorance of the freed slaves, looked defeated already. Curtis grabbed his horn and handed it to Wilmer. Sound stand to, Sergeant, he ordered. When the echoes faded, Curtis's shout could be heard even by the orcs. Stand up! The day ain't done! If we can get that ugly critter, we can fight a few boys who lack the sense to know they're dead. The truth of that struck home, and some of them snorted. A few even laughed. The defenders straightened, and the captains began moving again, no longer shocked by the magnitude of the enemy's strength. Seeing that the paralysis had been snapped, Curtis turned to Wilmer. It's time, my friend. Help me get dressed for the dancin', he winked. You still want to wear all that steel? Curtis, in your condition, it'll kill you, he replied. Though crafted by dwarves to be lighter and stronger than any practical human armor, it still weighed over 30 pounds. It was only yesterday that you could walk again at all. It's expected by the boys. Hurt morale if I don't. Besides, I got the exemption to wear it. And you went to a lot of effort to save it from the fort. After that, you'd better get to your position. Wilmer assented, and the two went off to finish dressing Curtis in dwarf-made chain and plate. It was of royal quality. Men wearing such without an exemption could be punished by as much as death, even king's guards. Down at the switchback, Orgroth was equally astounded. After they did that to the demon, he still wants to attack? Vlanshra stared uphill for a moment before answering. My lord captain is taking advantage of their present weakness. It will be some time before Despair's exorcist has that amount of power again. He is vulnerable. The orc understood. That kind of thought was not something that was that kind of might was not something that was seen every day. Attacking after it had been spent made perfect sense strategically. Sorry, kind of stumbling a little bit tonight. Upon the hill overlooking the race, the commanders of the relief column had come to the same conclusion. Any word from the messengers? The young captain asked. Sergeant Master Acklin just shook his head. Here's your bolt quiver too, Owen, Taurus said, handing over the rest of the fen hunter's ammunition. The legionnaires were approaching the first line of stakes, and the defenders were loosing arrows at a fearful rate, mostly to no apparent use. Each shaft found a legionnaire as they boiled through the gap in the hills, but only the enchanted shafts had a noticeable effect. They and the quarrels. The mages were desperately casting spells, weirds, and even charms, trying to slow the assault. The dwarves of Brander's squad were frantically reloading crossbows, small ones and the hunting ones of Taurus. The minor bolts of the regular crossbows caused more damage than the arrows, but only the worm-killing bolts were powerful enough to hinder the advance by themselves, punching through 2 or 3 corpsemen, knocking them down. The assault reached the southern hill, simply blasting through the remaining gully traps with weight of numbers. Oh. Tildar was ready for this. From the southern end... Oh, we're in an ad. So I'll wait. How long is it going to go? About 30 more seconds. So I'll just hold off. Have a sip of my beverage here while I'm waiting. And we're almost there. If people are actually listening, I want them to be able to hear the whole thing. So I don't want to be reading through an ad. It's one thing to be gaming through an ad, but to be reading through one. Okay, it says that the ad is over, so we'll get back into it. All right, where were we? Okay, Tildar was ready for this. From the southern end of the spur, he launched 4 bolts from pre-aimed crossbows into the line of stakes on the north slope of the hill. Each bolt had been set to spark when loosed, causing the oil-soaked wood and earth of this defensive trap to burst into flame. The assault halted for the moment, with the legionnaires walled off from their target. Braun had expected something like that. He would have done the same had the situation been reversed. The fire was too strong for him to order a simple, direct assault. Any legionnaire who made it through this blaze would be weakened severely. That gave the defenders a decided advantage, having the capacity for plunging archery while the legionnaires could not close with them. The arrows were an irritation, unless enchanted. The number of arrows needed to destroy a legionnaire by archery alone was close to 10,000. The crossbows were more effective, Braun noted, but already the defenders were husbanding them, wanting to maximize their effect. Noting no other action by the defenders, he saw they were playing for time. He would not let them. He barked several orders, and the undead began throwing green wood, dung, soaked clothing, whatever they could find at hand or in their packs into the fire. Soon the gulch between the hills was filled with smoke and steam, blocking the sight of the defenders, forcing them to wait for it to dissipate before they could use their bows again. The battle ground to a halt. Braun nodded, but he wanted more than that. Vlanshra! Down in the ravine, the undead officer from the fort heard his captain speak. Above the southern race, the relief company watched impotently as the battle unfolded. We should do something, Sergeant Master, Thoron, a half-elven wizardess, said determinedly. Yes, ma'am, Acklin replied. But what? My men might be able to feather the undead from here, but why? At this range, an arrow would just be a decoration for a corpse man. You may just say you're too far back from the fight, too. We have to wait for reinforcements. Could we not still assault the orcs? She asked. No, he replied patiently, recalling she was new to combat. Not after so long. Maybe we'd have had a chance if the assault had been carried out right when they arrived, but by now even the worst of orc soldiery'd have made rudimentary defenses, and that orc captain's too disciplined for my taste. He won't make many mistakes. But has he not wounded? War is not mine expertise, but even I know that orcs would exploit such a situation to depose their wounded commander. The sergeant master nodded, but Thuran saw him become even more troubled. Usually that'll happen, but we'd have heard it if it had been done or tried. There have been no sounds of fighting from here. That tells me more than anything that these orcs are good. Perhaps they assassinated him, she pointed out, and he shook his head. There still would have been fighting, as other orcs decided to rearrange things again. Orc mutinies happen in groups until the new commanders put fear in them. Quiet says they're real soldiers. Now, Sergeant Master, Turk called. Orcs are heading up the gully. Our friends won't be able to see them for the smoke. Bows, bows! Bugler, sound infantry on the flank! Thuran watched as 40-plus archers of the relief unit loosed once the orcs heading up the galley on the north side were in bowshot. At odd angles and never less than 90 yards, the arrows did not have as much effect as more direct bowshots would have. The orcs were still respectful of them, particularly since they were coming straight down due to the difference in elevation. Thuran observed that the sergeant master was right. Heavily armed and armored, the orcs advanced steadily under an arrow barrage that could have broken a cavalry charge. Grimly they held their shields in readiness to absorb the arrows from the kingsmen on the ridge. Hundreds of arrows were loosed, and many orcs died, but the discipline that Goragorath had instilled in them was worthy of any proud regiment. Slowly, shields raised, often pin-cushioned, the vanguard advanced beyond the reach of the reinforcing archers, passing behind the rock hill that was the final extent of the defenders' crag. But they had brought the assault to the attention of the missionaries. Arrows began pouring through the wreath of smoke, being loosed not at the sight of the orcs, but the sound of their march. Unable to see the arrows coming, Orgroth began to lose orcs by the basketful. Charge in, he roared, knowing that soon they would start to back up instinctively, be driven back into the view of the men to the south. Targeted from two directions and angles, his command would be reaped like wheat. They made it behind the wall. Oh, no, sorry, that's a question. They made it behind the wall, Ackland said, incredulous respect in his voice. A fellow could have walked on the arrows we were loosing. Thuran paused. The comment put a vague idea into her mind. The orcs rushed on, hoping to close with the archers and slaughter them by blade. They rushed almost headlong, not caring for the noise now. The archers did not have direct sight to attack, but had to arc their shafts into the orcs. The closer the orcs, the trickier such archery became, especially since the huge tree on the hill's northwest edge blocked most of the final stretch of the gully. They charged through bronze smoke, the arrow fall thinning around them, and they came to the barricade. Their charge stopped completely. On the eastern side of this impromptu fortification, a grown man standing upon his toes, stretched upward, could reach the top. 12 feet to the west, a sudden steepening of the gully made it so that the orcs had to stand on one another's shoulders to top this ad hoc wall. Orgroth cursed orders, and the orcs in the gully began to form teams. 2 orcs apiece gave another a hand up, throwing him upward to catch the barrier's top and climb upon it. A little more than a squad preceded Orgroth to the top. Standing, he just barely saw the sentry in the tree right before she loosed. Falling backward, he landed upon the orcs who had tossed him up. They dropped the next orc, but the fall saved their lives. Fueranath, Orathan said. The wood brambles, oil, bodies, even some of the barricade stones caught fire. The orcs atop it had only heartbeats before they were engulfed. The defenders quickly killed the only 3 who escaped to the east. Legionnaires upon the spur! Turning, Otherin still could not see the gulch. Suspecting the worst, he spoke, and a blast of wind began pushing the rest of the smoke westward into the orcs, clearing the gully to view. Bronn had not been idle, he saw. With ladders that the undead had bound together while they were hidden, a squad of the corpse men had scaled out of the gully onto the spur near Oxbow and Tildor. The narrow path prevented them from being overrun, but they were cut off from the rest of the mission. While the defenders were still reforming from the orc sortie, Bronn's company charged the fortifications. The fire burned in front of them, but the undead warriors threw sections of the dead riding drakes hide upon the wall of flame, opening gaps. Nearly instantly, 2 squads were south of the fire. More were coming. Lelebrand saw that the advance team of defenders was out of position and would be overrun. Equina, the elf captain shouted. De Vivian Astruinius. 25 war horses charged around the mages in the center of the hill and made for the spaces in the fire line. Rearing, kicking, and biting, they held the gaps, and for a moment it seemed that the undead would be driven back. Bronn was ready, however. Nooses, whips, and spears hurtled from the legionnaires, snaring and killing the horses. Loose at the rope holders, Therion shouted. Despite the shafts, the undead were able to... Despite the shafts, one more time. Despite the shafts, the undead were able to pull 8 of the steeds into the gully where they were cut to pieces. The legionnaires worked to snare the remaining mounts, this time catching Curtis's war roan, and began to pull him down. The proud horse was as tough as his rider. Rearing mightily, he jerked the ropes out of the hands of his would-be captors, pulling one of them underneath him when the corpse man was too slow to relinquish it. He tried to draw his sword, and iron-shod hooves knocked the blade away as the horse smashed the luckless lich to a pulp. More ropes caught the steed. Other legionnaires caught the ones that already bound him, and the roan was inexorably drawn toward the blades that would kill him. Changing direction, the 4-footed warrior charged, leaping over the first rank of undead, bowling over the smashing those holding the lariats. Within seconds, the rest of the surviving war horses raced down into the gully. Brander led his armored squad down as well to take advantage of the horse-driven chaos, hoping to take the 7 banners. They'll be fine, Owen, Curtis said, grabbing his arm as the fen hunter started to follow. There's no formation harder to break and overrun than that of a dwarven battle team. So it proved, but the dwarven tactics were designed to fight orcs. Soon Brander bogged down as the legionnaires took damage, but could not be incapacitated by one blow alone. Bronn left enough undead to pin them there. Leading the attack upon the steeds, he killed 3 mounts himself. Up, 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 he roared in the legion's battle tongue. 3 squads pierced the gaps in the fire line after rushing past the horses. Bolts and arrows met the charge but could not break it. So the defenders dropped their bows to grab the spears and rough-made stakes they had waiting. Longer than pikes, they were raised in perfect time to pierce most of the undead, those not trapped being blasted by the mages at the as the swiftest of the defenders ran forward to dismember and behead the ones impaled. Impaled but not helpless. Hot Hands raced forward. This is easy, he thought as he beheaded his third warrior. He tried to move forward but could not. Startled, he looked down to see a Legionnaire's sword being withdrawn from his rib cage. Falling, his last sight was of his decapitated killer grabbing its severed head to put back upon its neck. Nickel was shorter than the undead. Like the rest of the dwarves, freed from the mines, he was poorly dressed for the battle, his slavers knowing to not leave anything like armor for even the most downtrodden dwarf. They had tried to put fear into their dwarves' hearts, but that fear did not extend to undead men. Nickel found that the battle axe he was armed with was not much different than the hammer he had used all his life. Smashing through the armor of shins, ankles, wrists, whatever he could hack at, he advanced between the stakes he had helped cut that morning. As he started to swing at a knee, he felt a sharp pain pierce his leg. The arm he had just severed had grasped his leg while it fell, digging into the artery. Dying from blood loss, he smiled. His last stroke had still severed the knee. Ethel hated legionnaires. They had enslaved her and her mother when they had overrun their farm. 3 of her brothers and her father had been recruited that day. They had not bothered killing the 2 women, but knew that the orcs could use them, and that use had little to do with mining. Her 4 half-brothers, though, had fought very well in the uprising despite their Orcan blood. I've never seen that. Orckan, Orcan. It's a new word for me. Maybe it's his term for half-orc, I guess. Now all she had was the hope of revenge and maybe even escape if they won. Regardless, she would not be a slave any more. As these thoughts flashed through her mind, she came upon one of the corpse men and slashed with her sword at his neck. Dear Lethe, the impaled corpse said to her, do you not know that killing your brother is a sin? Mm. Startled at hearing a pet name she had not in decades, she stood agape for a moment before she realized that any of the undead might know it now. She swung her sword. She never found out if he truly was her brother, but he spared her from recapture forever. Brander saw the last of the war horses escape north out of the gully, and he grunted. They may no longer be in the fight, but 4 or 5 perhaps had escaped. The closeness of the gully had frustrated the dwarves, keeping them from gathering momentum, and now he watched virtually helpless as most of Braun's company surged up the hill. Braun had tricked them. Not only was he very powerful, he'd left a powerful subordinate behind in the gully. Brander could not close and deal with these undead. The sergeant major was powerful enough in his own right to directly attack the dwarven armor with the Legion bond. Brander could sense the probing as the undead sought to age the iron. They could understand it, but it meant he had to be defensive. Oh, they could withstand it, sorry, but it meant they had to be defensive. His only consolation was that Braun would have to leave some of the undead behind to pin him down, or else he would follow them up the hill where his dwarves would not be so confined. This was little consolation, for like the other captains he had recognized Braun and did not expect that such a veteran commander would make the mistake of letting the dwarves back into the main battle. He was right. The last legionnaires through each of the gaps turned back and poured blood from the dead worm upon the dragon scales. When the blood reached the flames, it nearly exploded, so quickly did it catch fire, and the wall burned hotter than ever. Braun himself was one of these. Facing south, he left the battle in the gully to his sergeant major. 4 squads were in the gully, not counting those that Tilder and Oxbow had yet to drive back off the spur, leaving Braun nearly 100 of his command upon the hill that had not been felled. The undead captain, however, would not let the defenders have even that advantage. Using his mastery of the Legion bond again, he drew severed arms, legs, and heads to him, along with their torsos, and 30 of the undead returned to their captain's call. Seeing the corpses reassemble before their eyes, the defenders were stunned and shaken as they abandoned their forward line for the main forts on the top of the hill. Therion and Thames traded a look. The banners proved it, but this was proof beyond proof. They faced Bronn, captain of the legions, second only to Wraith and the Banelord. It was Bronn who had rescued the Banelord's army from the Battle of the Lake, a kingbreaker. The few great captains who had survived facing him were legends even Owen had heard in his isolated youth. And the Lich King, the Azanawath, William, and the other champions were gone. The lords broke off their look as many yards away Curtis cursed. I wish he'd stop doing that. It unsettles the kids. When the reintegrated legionnaires were reordered into ranks, Bronn's assault proceeded. The undead marched methodically, pressing the entire line of the defenders. Even the wizards drew their blades. Through steel and staff they directed their power, felling undead with each stroke, only to have Bronn return them. Thames and Therion led a squad of the defenders from their left end, the warrior elves among them. They drove into Bronn's right flank, and Bronn let them come, reviving his fallen soldiers behind them, cutting them off. With great effort they drove within a knife's throw of the undead captain. Therion deftly drew and threw a dagger in one motion, swiftly returning a sword to his throwing hand. Like his swords, the knife was made of rebonded steel, metal taken from the undead as spoils when a legion standard was captured. The bond in such steel was reversed. It killed legionnaires like they were still mortal. As the lords fell back, the dagger buried itself in Bronn's neck, and an explosion hid him as the steel's power was released relentlessly. The blast cleared, and Bronn grinned at them, dropping the dust of the once knife to the ground. Most of the slave defenders in the east line panicked at that sight and broke as Bronn now ordered a charge along the entire center. The freed dwarves and Braster's group in the eastern redoubt began expending crossbow bolts like rain, but they were not able to stop the charge that would punch through their line at the eastern center, and thus force the defenders to fight in front and behind. The few ex-slaves who did not flee the center right line were quickly crushed. They would have been utterly undone then, but for Curtis. His eye had seen that the eastern line between the center two forts and Braster's redoubt on the east end would be the most difficult to breach, but the deadliest if broken. So he'd had Oremon and Otheron prepare something special. As the auxiliaries fled for their last line of defense, the old commando selflessly threw himself against the legionnaires. He leapt from the pile of wood where he was standing, and Otheron's weird to ignite it triggered as he hit the ground. Flames streaked eastward along pre-soaked lines, resealing the center right between his position and Braster's fort in 2 rows of fire 20 yards apart, halting the breakthrough for a moment. This gave the ballistae crews the time to impale the undead to their front, and the oil teams the opportunity to bury them in fire as they were pinned against the main defenses. Over 4 squads violently burst into flames. 2 squads had pushed past the forts, though. Behind the ballistae crews, the many freed slaves were caught with them between the 2 fires. Curtis ran eastward to their aid, armed with spear and phalanx shield. His charge went unnoticed. The flames roared, and the trapped auxiliaries held the undead's attention like fawns would that of wolves. Inside his rectangular shield he had 4 small spears, each of the 3-foot-long shafts mounted in its own atlatl. a throwing lever that added considerable punch. He drove his thick spear through 3 undead from behind, rendering them immobile, and he switched to the javelins. Some undead raised their shields, and 3 javelins pierced through them into their bearers. The last javelin punched through its target and pinned him to the corpse man behind him. Next he charged, beginning his true attack. Grabbing both handles of his rectangular shield, he smashed into the 4 legionnaires he had speared, knocking over 9 of the 2 squads. Once they were down, he threw the shield among those he tumbled to hinder them further. He drew his heavy short sword and reached for his bandolier of throwing knives. Ahriman had weirded them to hold the heat of a forge fire. He approached one of the downed corpsemen and beheaded him like he was swinging a meat cleaver. Several legionnaires neared, but his thrown knives slowed them, and burned until he was able to decapitate 3 more with his sword. It was very heavy, 2 feet long, 4 inches wide, and half an inch thick at its center. It was an axe in the shape of a sword, and it was perfect for this butchery. But spears and knives had only bought him time. His long swords were the weapons he needed to win. "Rally, cubs, rally!" he shouted to the slaves, throwing his last knife and then the short sword into the approaching enemy. To stand where no man stands, he bellowed, drawing his long swords from over his shoulders to meet the second squad that had now reformed. The undead neared quickly, and Curtis retreated. He backed up toward one of the fire lines, and the squad slowed. A yard or so from where the wood pile come pyre joined the firewall, he halted. The undead paused, hesitating to close with this swordsman on his own ground. Curtis took advantage of this to remove his helmet, knowing that they would want to recruit him. His armor alone proved that, and they would not behead him. Then he threw the helmet at them as he shouted from under his chainmail hood. "Come on, you old bones! None of us is getting any younger." The undead squad sergeant gave an order, and they came on. Trusting his armor to withstand the backstabbing, Curtis ducked the first attack and sprawled its legionnaire over his back into the magical fire. As that corpse man began burning like a fuse, Curtis parried the next one's stroke with his left-hand sword. With a twist, he knocked the arm outward, leaving an opening for his right-hand blade to sever the neck. Sidestepping the still oncoming corpse, he knocked it behind him onto the first legionnaire, who was blazing. The next 2 came on warily. Curtis stepped into them, and with a savage chop severed a foot of the one upon his left, who fell forward face down. The other legionnaire tried to run him through, but the old sergeant spun out of the stroke, avoiding the blow, stabbing this corpse through the heart from behind, circling through to put the fire at his rear again, as another legionnaire's throwing knife bounced off his back. He beheaded the one on his sword with the other blade, while he stepped on the downed lich, forcing it to stay put. Stabbing the fallen heads, he dipped them in the fire and flung them toward the other legionnaires. This bought the seconds he needed to behead the one he stood on. Ripping a sword from an undead hand, he drove it through the back of the one on the ground. Then he pushed the standing corpse off of his own sword, propelling it into the wall of flame. The rest of the squad attacked, but had to come piecemeal due to the position he had taken, allowing Curtis to face them all. He cut off a leg here, a wrist there, an arm, a foot, once, thrice more. He stayed alive by moving constantly next to the pyre, using it to guard his rear and flanks. He took several minor wounds as they slowly destroyed his dwarf-made armor, and the under-sergeant of the squad left him a bit winded after slamming him with a shield, but Curtis also took his head. Just the squad sergeant now remained. This legionnaire, however, had seen Curtis's skill and did not underestimate him. Warily he backed away as 3 of the freed slaves approached behind him, trying for ambush. The undead sergeant pivoted once he was 5 yards from the sergeant-at-arms, and with noteworthy skill he dropped them almost effortlessly. Slowly then the two sergeants circled, probing, watching for an opening. Curtis faked a stumble, and this undead ran at him, only to drop like a stone as Curtis deflected its strike, nearly taking its head with a flowing sweep. Rolling upon the ground, the lich desperately tried to keep from being pinned. It slashed out, catching Curtis on the leg. His armor saved the limb, but Curtis stumbled backwards, this time not faking at all. The lich recovered first. Now Curtis had to roll desperately, and only a backhanded sword's flat kept the alcoholic sergeant from being run through. The legionnaire backed away, just keeping his knee from buckling, as Curtis restood. The bond quickly healed the legionnaire, but Curtis was limping and gasping for breath. Wilmer's words proved too true. Curtis had only begun recovering from his forced binge in Brask's dungeon. Despite decades of training, conditioning, and magiric medicine, exertion and heat had now exhausted his stamina. He was ill again, nauseous, and suddenly he doubled over to vomit. The wight raced at him, seeing an ironclad opening, and Curtis barely kicked a severed arm into the legionnaire's feet, tripping him short of his target. As the undead rolled to face him, Curtis vomited again, this time in its face. The corpse man stabbed blindly, and its sword punched into his now rent breastplate and hauberk, but Curtis's ribs deflected the stab outward. Curtis severed the sword arm with his right and drove his left blade through the corpse's eye. Then he pulled the sword from his body, nearly fainting. Gathering himself, he drove the lich weapon through its owner's chest, and after beheading his opponent, the sergeant-at-arms collapsed. After a few moments, Curtis stirred and sat up. Slowly he removed equipment and damaged armor, knowing he had too much to wear in his condition. He felt lighter and much cooler, though certain he had heat stroke, and his side throbbed. Finding his water skin, he took one of the salt pills from its outer pouch, drank, and then emptied the rest over his head. He stood wincing and saw that another squad had cleared the first fire line, its oil now nearly gone. He barely regained his swords before he was surrounded. To stand where no man stands. Caught away from the fire, now unarmored, Curtis was too exposed. Rather than be cut down from behind, he charged the thickest group of lich men, rightly believing their leader to be there. This undead lieutenant, one of Braun's platoon captains, struck through Curtis's defenses, running him through the stomach as the sergeant cut off another legionnaire's hand. Curtis fell forward on the blade that killed him, closing with the lieutenant, forcing his right through the undead's armor into its heart as his left sword swung back. It came too low. It took the sword arm below the shoulder instead of the neck above it. Bellowing in rage, the Legion officer slammed Curtis in the face with his shield and left him to die of the distemper and the perhaps days of agony of a belly wound. The undead had to exploit the breach, and more defenders were coming. Spent and stunned, the old commando did not rise again. But he had fallen mightily. His forethought and actions had kept the undead out of the defenders' rear long enough for the heavy weapons teams to use their tools to very devastating effect. He had also maimed several legionnaires, but most of all he had killed a dozen others. As it happened, all of them forever. And that is actually the end of that chapter, right in the middle of the fight. So, we're just going to have to wait a week to get to the next one, and it's actually maybe not. The next chapter is really short. It's like 12 pages. I think I'm going to press on. We'll go ahead and do chapter 17 as well. Because how long have we been going? 44 minutes? Yeah, I'm just going to keep going. My throat's doing okay for the moment, so we'll just knock out 2 chapters. So, chapter 17 is Anarchy Again. A squad, Ackland breathed in shock as he watched from the other hill. An entire squad, sergeant and all. That is rare, then? The elf Mage Brethel asked. Ackland did not answer as they watched a cursing Wilmer lead 20 of the defenders from the now re-secure center to where Curtis had fallen. Zealously, they and those Curtis had rescued overwhelmed the remaining undead that had battled the old sergeant. Wilmer himself took the lieutenant's head, and only 3 legionnaires made it back over the first line of defenses. Brethel repeated his question as Wilmer had Curtis carried into the center fort. Rare? Mage, no man's ever taken a squad of undead by himself. William the Great only killed 15 at the Battle of the Lake, and he was never cut off alone. By the heavens, we have to get over there. Theron came up, but for a moment did not speak as they watched Wilmer's group hack Legion corpses to pieces and throw limbs, torsos, and skulls into the nearest fire. This done, she spoke a question. Sergeant Master, when our reinforcements arrive, how will the blitz lines and rope bridges be deployed? With the fall of Curtis and the through's failure, the battle descended into chaos. The defenders' line had held on the left, but Wilmer judged that the breastworks between the center outpost and the redoubt of Braster were no longer defensible. They had lost too many of the people who would man them. Hoping to draw more squads into cross volleys, he ordered the first and secondary battlements of this line stripped of arms and ignited, and withdrew the survivors to the center forts, sending 5 of the most exhausted to Braster. Lelebrin and the 2 lords had been driven toward the tree, and Taurus's attempt to rescue them finally let the legionnaires sever the western line. The mages rallied the western center, but several small groups of defenders were isolated. The undead were just as fragmented. Curtis had choked the legionnaires' momentum, and the defenders of the firing crews and ballistae had hit the lichmen with the heavy arms. As Brander had predicted, the weapons were mostly destroyed in their first use, but the undead formation was shattered, with dozens of them impaled or incinerated. A handful of them were even hurled into the gully with the dwarves. Braun waited to impose more order. Despite the damage, he could revive all his casualties once the battle was done, but it would take an exhaustive effort. For the moment, he concentrated upon the second team of the defenders now driving toward him, just southwest of the spur. Braun, Zothras said, cutting down the last corpse man between him and their captain. Zothras, Braun replied in kind. For an everlasting moment, the 2 looked at each other. They had been friends before Brian founded the first legions of man, and Braun founded the undead legions in homage and mockery. What? That was a weird sentence. Then Braun attacked. For several seconds they fought, blade to blade, shield to shield, before another legionnaire struck Zothras from behind. While he was stunned, Braun slashed him through the throat. Of the few defenders who were isolated, Taurus Longreach was perhaps the best well off. Dragoneers train extensively for their profession, and a man who makes his living outthinking dragons is well equipped to outthink anyone. The 7 legionnaires that drove him toward the southwest section of the hill spread out, sensing that this swordsman had elven blood, and thus could not be recruited. Cautiously, they cut him off, not wanting to underestimate his swordsmanship. But it was his cunning that was the deadliest thing about him. When he felt the brambles behind him, Taurus used his last illusion armament. With a blast of smoke, suddenly 12 of him faced the whites. The legionnaires rushed in to smash them, trying to catch him before he could win past. But this weird also gave the user a moment of invisibility. He slipped behind them while they were decoyed. When the last doppelganger shattered to a legion blade, they turned to see Taurus striking a spark to the oil he had just poured in the grass. As the wind swept the flame toward them, he lit his last 2 oil bombs and tossed them ahead of the flames, leaving them to the wind and the downhill slope. The rest of the defenders were in poorer shape. They were scattering and nearly out of fire weapons. The wizards were truly husbanding their power now, and the swordsmen were growing very weary of cutting 5 men down to have 3, 4, or all of them return. As Braun's under-officers used the power he'd rationed to them. It was the presence of Braun, however, that made the battle pointless. Two more groups of the defenders tried to engage him. Wilmer attempted to relieve the 2 lords and elf captain who had been driven toward the tree to the northwest so they could re-engage Braun. Wilmer could not break through to them, however, and was driven back toward the southern side of the hill, Jed and Terwin lying lifelessly behind him. Istorin's group was more successful, and the elf battle battled the foe captain with Terran, Thranduil and Owen guarding his back. The legionnaires were hesitant to engage Owen. His skill was limited, but power filled him, and it came forth with every blow he struck. Even a minor hit would drop them. Full strikes blasted them to dust. As Braun engaged Istorin, though, they swarmed Owen, cutting him off from the others, and he could only focus on the immediate battle for the moment. Parrying one blade with his sword, he saw another coming at his side. Reflexively, he caught it. It should have taken his hand, but the legionnaire was staggered by the power that now coursed through him. Owen ripped the blade from this paralyzed lich, and flipping it to catch the hilt, he started laying about him, driving them back. Gaining time, he looked around. He saw Terran falling off of a legion sword. Thranduil had already been overborne, but Istorin and Braun still battled furiously. The elf lord, with his shield upon his back and 2 swords in his hands, he was fighting in the same way as did Thames and Therion. His 2 weapons hummed as they passed through the air with blurring speed, and as Owen started forward, Istorin found his opening. He knocked Braun's shield out wide with his right hand sword, and then buried that blade into the evil captain's chest. The elf brought his left in to sever Braun's neck, but Braun struck the incoming blow with his own sword's flat, deflecting the elf sword upward and his own forward. Finishing the motion, he twisted his blade, driving it through the elf's mail and chest as the elven blade struck sparks on his helmet. Owen charged, raging furiously at the deaths of his comrades. 6 legionnaires tried to intercept him, but Owen blasted through them, his anger magnifying his strength, so that even when he parried their blows, they disintegrated. The half squad was destroyed within heartbeats. "So, child, thou dost have some authority," Braun challenged archaically. "Come try it against mine." Owen came on, incensed. Slashing, stabbing, smashing, Owen tried with every tactic, trick, and gambit he knew to breach his opponent's defenses. For nothing, this was Braun. He leapt, ducked, parried, blocked, and avoided Owen's attacks, seemingly with less effort than Curtis had in Owen's training. Angered and embarrassed, Owen doubled his efforts, and for a moment Braun gave ground. Then the vile captain took to the offensive, pressing Owen heavily. Infuriated even more, the worm hunter tried harder, but could not touch him. Seeing a grin on Braun's face, Owen lost all restraint. With 2 furious strikes, he unleashed all of his rage. Now nearly back to the level he had used against despair, Braun stopped, smiling, catching them on his shield. Power exploded blindly over the 2 combatants. Gasping from the effort, Owen stepped away to clear his vision. He looked back to where his opponent still stood, with a damaged arm, as his shattered shield hit the ground. "That stung," Braun said offhandedly to Owen, who was staring at him in astonishment. "I should be angry. I have not lost a shield since the Battle of the Lake 2 ages ago. Now see that I too have some means." With that, he raised his damaged hand. As Owen stared at it, the blast wound disappeared. Bronn then gestured, and the 6 legionnaires that Owen had just killed suddenly reformed from the dust. Groaning, Owen attacked them again, striking them down. Bronn recalled each every time Owen felled it. Growing angry again, Owen shouted, "Bring them on, dead man! I can stay at this all day." "No, that quickly becomes boring," Bronn said, matter-of-factly. Reaching over his left shoulder, he drew another sword that Owen had previously not noticed. "Try me now, child." Bronn was charging almost before he had finished his challenge. Owen raised his defenses, now realizing that Bronn was toying with him, had always been toying with him. He could have died from nearly a dozen mortal wounds if Bronn had wanted. "You poor infant," Bronn said insultingly, as the flats of his sword slipped through Owen's guard to slap him in the face. "You have had less than 6 months' training to be a swordsman. Do not be shocked, babe," he said, laughing at Owen's expression. "I have trained more swordsmen than the number of breaths you have drawn." His sword scratched Owen's face, arms, and calves, despite Owen's parrying. "I know a new swordsman on sight, and who would know one better?" His flats left bruises upon Owen's knees, left shoulder, and even in his armpits. His voice began to rise as his anger at Owen's audacity became more and more apparent. "Who are you to face me? Who? Who?" he said, punctuating each with a punch to Owen's face. You would wield 2 blades against me? I invented this style of fighting. I am Bronn." His flats made Owen's head ring, bursting his eardrums, which healed almost immediately. "I fought with Brian and Oli, fathers of man. I was the first man ever to kill a drake, and I have killed countless ones since. I took the field against Barandarenthrath, captain of the Azani, and defeated him. I fought the Azani Woth. 12 of the 13 Lich Kings died by my hand." He finally disarmed Owen, slapping his wrists. "I have killed over 10,000 kings. How many nations have you destroyed? I defeated Brian himself." Owen saw stars as a sword flat hit his forehead again. "I am Bronn, captain of the legions, father of the wights, king of the undead. I am the demon man." With that roar, he ran Owen through the gut. "What next, Bronn?" "With me dead," Owen gritted defiantly. Bronn snorted. "Dead? No, child. I can see your innards. I missed your kidneys and your spleen. I scraped your liver, cut your intestines, and ripped a hole in your stomach. Painful to be sure, but hardly fatal to a man," he said insultingly. "With as much power as you have in your flesh?" Horrified at what that meant, Owen could only shake his head in denial. Bronn did not let him speak. "Yes, boy, and I know what I say. I have killed thousands better than you. You should have mastered your power and engaged me from a distance. The power within you will not permit you to die. For ages, Oli's legion defied even the Banelord. 1,000,000 hours and more I lived before founding the undead legions, and I have seen 10,000,000 days since. But never have I seen such an opportunity as this. The authority of the Glee sages in the possession of an utter ignorant neophyte, one who was stupid enough to close with me. Oli must be spinning in his barrow if he has not rotted to dust." Bronn wrenched the sword from Owen's body, and the Fen man collapsed. Bronn motioned, and the half-squad again returned. 2 of them seized Owen, holding him upright. The other 4 began repeatedly running Owen through, though they never delivered an instantly fatal blow. As Owen screamed repeatedly, Bronn menacingly went on. "The power within you will not let you die, not very easily. But with each blow your flesh and will weaken, diluting the power within your blood. When it is sufficiently diluted, I will seize your mind, and thus soul and flesh, and it will be mine." The 4 legionnaires stopped their torture, and Bronn began running Owen through himself. Owen felt him leave a residue of evil behind after each thrust. The power of the sages cleansed it easily, but Bronn ran him through repeatedly, so the residue began to grow. Owen felt the power within him respond and try to keep up, particularly when Bronn determined that he would survive thrusts through the lungs. New levels of pain ripped through Owen with each new injury, and he realized the first was not as painful anymore. No, a heart thrust would kill you, Bronn murmured. He plunged the sword back through Owen's stomach, this time pouring all of his power through the blade. Owen shrieked. The pain of before was nothing, and he wanted desperately for it to end. Suddenly he felt Bronn's eagerness, and visions passed through his mind, memories that were thousands, even tens of thousands of years old. The pain multiplied. He longed for unconsciousness, but Bronn's fervor told him that if he passed out, he was dead. Desperately he clung on, remembering the dream as Bronn's mind sought to crush his own. On the brink of annihilation, he embraced his identity, entrenching, fortifying himself with it. I am Owen MacOwen, Clan MacOwen. I am Owen's son of Owen, Owen's son. He held on to this fact more tightly than a wolf's jaw multiplied by a shark bite, using it as an anchor, and his memory of the vision tree shielded him. Deceiving the demon man into thinking Owen was gone, Bronn's assault fell back, and Owen's mind pursued. Startled, Bronn raced back to the offensive. Their two minds wrestled, refusing to give any ground. Then Bronn used the 6 other legionnaires to also attack Owen's mind. Suddenly, Owen was outnumbered and surrounded. But he refused to yield. Slowly he began to be submerged beneath the minds crushing him, and he could feel not only the sword in his stomach, but the hand holding it. He could see from his eyes, but also from Bronn's. He could feel the bond of the legionnaires. His mind was being ripped apart. He saw himself through Bronn's eyes as oblivion was reached. Then he felt the shock run through all the legionnaires as an axe blade severed Bronn's spine, and the cold steel as a sword ran Bronn through the heart. Abruptly, the 6 proxy minds were gone. Only Bronn's remained, and now was fleeing. Owen seized it with his own mind, slowing Bronn before he could turn to his new assault, and he heard Bronn shout in rage. Then Bronn escaped, leaving only a trace of a connection. Opening his eyes again, he fell to his knees. Owen saw Bronn's sword slide out of his own stomach, still held by a severed arm. He saw a dwarven axe sever one of Bronn's legs, as well as the dwarf's sword that was holding Bronn upright. He saw the sword piercing Bronn's heart, and with perfect clarity he saw another sword sweeping from left to right behind the legionnaire, finally detach Bronn's head from his neck. The dregs of Bronn's mind exploded inside his own. Now fully free of the demon man's influence, Owen blessedly lost consciousness. Oxbow and Tilder surveyed their handiwork for a moment, making sure that Bronn was truly down. Bellicose! What a tough son of a witch! Oxbow cursed, seeing the 2 dead elves and the dead king's guards. Undeniably, Tilder said, moving toward Owen. He was much stronger than the 12 upon the spur combined. The dwarf knelt next to Owen and felt for a pulse. How is he? Oxbow swallowed, unable to say it. No, Tilder answered the unspoken question. By all rights, he should be dead a dozen times. He paused to clear his sinuses and spit phlegm at the legion of corpses. But Owen lives. The Bale captain was right. The sage book is still alive within him, and I think he will heal himself. See, most of the sword thrusts are already gone. The tension, the fear, left Oxbow. He sat down heavily upon a rock, exhausted from effort and terror. Putting his sword point upon the ground, he wearily leaned his head against the hilt. Beginning to mumble a prayer, he was so dazed that he nearly fell off the boulder he sat on. Are you well, Captain? Braster said, coming up to them. Oxbow nodded. The fight's taken a bit out of me. I thought they I thought you're supposed to stay in your little fort. Braster handed him a water skin and pointed at Braun's corpse as Tilder dismembered it. With him gone, we just need to finish the rest. I'm going to place a squad or two of my defenders here to guard the base of the spur. We don't want the Legionnaires to be able to get around the big fire line. I'd throw him into it, he gestured to Braun again, but the slope of the hill is too steep. He's someone we want to be sure of. That is true, Tilder said, leaving Braun's corpse. The dwarf had chopped the Legion captain into over a dozen pieces, stripped him of all his armor, and driven Braun's own swords into his heart and skull. Now we have to return to the fighting, Sergeant Braster. Could you have some of your men move young Owen into your redoubt? Despite what they did to him, he is alive. If the fight does come this way again, I would have him as safe as we can make him. Braster nodded. Captain Oxbow? He asked. Get going, both of you. I'll be along when I've caught my breath. Nodding, they left, and after Owen was moved, Oxbow was alone with his thoughts. Splashing water on his face to clear his mind, he realized that something was nagging at him. He was too tired to place it. Odd, he thought distractedly. The other undead right round here have fallen to dust. The proxy corpses were gone now with just a spot of spit to mark their dust. Even if he had not been dazed, old McCowan did not know enough about the undead to know what that meant. The battle reached a new level of intensity. With Braun's fall, the defenders finally had hope of overcoming the undead company, but without their captain to ration the bond, the remaining undead were actually more powerful, swelling in strength like downstream dams catching more water when the one upstream is breached. The officers and sergeants particularly grew stronger. The Legionnaires finally overran the western center position, killing Cormac and Idle, wounding Kindra among several others, but with support from Braster the position was retaken, and Braster's eastern fort was no longer assailable. But nearly half the undead remained to be killed. Lelebrin and the two lords held in front of the northwestern tree. Braun had been content to leave them pinned by a holding force, but with their new found power and the other legionnaires felt strong enough to storm their position. Thames' stroke blinded a legionnaire. Quickly his swords took the corpse man's hands and head. Lelebrin ran it through the heart, and this legionnaire disintegrated. Then the elf faced a new opponent. He beheaded the legionnaire, but this corpse man staggered backwards, and stabbing its sword into its own mouth, it brought the head out of the defender's reach to reset it upon its neck. The flesh resealed together, with the chin now off-center, facing slightly to the right. That doth be disturbing, Lelebrin said with a slight shudder. Therion knocked a charging legionnaire into the firewall to his left. The corpse man ignited like a fuse as the off-center undead came again. Lelebrin emphatically punched the off-center legionnaire, and he staggered back. Two others of the undead surged forward. They attacked together, but he parried their swords with his, while Therion and Thames struck. The legionnaire upon Lelebrin's left lost his shield hand, and then his head. The one upon the right fell backwards as Thames severed his leg. This legionnaire scooted backwards, seizing the fallen head as he went, and their skirmish stopped for the moment. The stump of the leg regrew two new legs, and Therion's opponent used his two new shield hands to set his severed head right next to the one that had grown over his left shoulder. You are right, that is sickening, Therion said. Off center, two heads, three legs, plus a fourth legionnaire came on again, and the spurted conversation ended. I don't know what's going on now as far as that. That's weird. Three legs went after Thames, and two heads attacked Therion. Off center and fourth came down the middle, engaging Lelibran. The three defenders were driven back into the tree, which the wizards had weirded against fire. This tree was old enough that its branches high enough that the defenders could reach the trunk if needed, but sword strokes were greatly restricted. Lelibran was the worst off, facing 2-to-1 odds. When off-center's advance was halted for a moment by a tangle of roots, the elf attacked. Using the limited room masterfully, he severed the hands of Fourth and then ran him through, but then his right-hand sword caught in the branches to his left as he tried to swing it across. Angrily, with no other option, he stepped 1 foot behind Fourth's ankles and punched him in the face. He tripped, but did not fall upon off-center. Worse, Fourth had the presence of mind to bring his arm up and jar Lelibran's arm as he fell. The weight of the undead man wrenched the sword from the elf as Fourth fell backward out of the tree's limbs. Weaponless, Lelibran would die. Savagely, he gripped his branch-caught blade with both hands, wrenching it back and down. Off-center came forward, leading with his shield, and Lelibran quickly searched around, seeing if he could escape sideways. The branches of the tree were too thick. If it trapped him at the trunk, he was dead. He was nearly there. Despairfully and desperately, he maneuvered his sword, trying to find an opening around the shield, trying just to bring the battle back to equal footing. The opportunity came when off-center's shield caught in the narrowing branches. When the legionnaire paused, his sword hand was exposed. The elf sliced it quickly at the wrist. The hand was not severed, but off-center dropped his sword. Before his foe could recover, Lelibran drove his sword upward through the undead man's chin into his skull. Off-center adapted instantly. Before his skull could be punched through and pried off-center grabbed Lelibran by the throat. The legionnaire choked him, and Lelibran had to use both hands to tear the grip from his neck. Half fainting, his head swimming from asphyxiation, he placed his feet on the trunk behind him and lunged forward, knocking the still healing legionnaire back and off balance. Lelibran kept with him as he fell and continued the motion, turning it into a roll, aided by the slight downward slope caused by the tree's roots. Oh, this is the last page. Pulling the legionnaire with him, he jarred his back on the inside of the shield, jabbing his own sword hilt painfully into his stomach. With his last coherent thought as they rolled, the elf brought both his legs into a tucked position and kicked outward as he let go with his hands. The legionnaire went flying away backwards from the tree, and for minutes Lelibran lay recovering his senses and breath, helpless. He should have slain me by now, the elf abruptly thought. Crawling beyond branch reach, he looked out to see Tilder bury his axe in kneeling two heads' necks as the two lords vivisected three legs. Taurus was just turning from two sets of bolt-punctured armor filled with dust and ashes. "Cousin!" Taurus stepped toward him and helped him to his feet. "You are hurt!" Lelibran shook his head, which was slightly painful. "Bruised, winded, choked," he said, still panting, "but nothing more. How fare we?" "Poorly, but better. The top of the hill is in chaos. Brander had, last we knew, backed his team against the spur to keep the undead from it. Tilder and Oxbow cut Braun down while he was torturing Owen. Tilder says Owen will live. At least 10 of our missionaries are down or dead, including Curtis, Istorin, and Zothras. Both elves are certainly dead, I am sorry to say. I have been unable to reach Otherin or Wilmer, but Braster has joined the fight in the center. We seem to have used all of our oil bombs, and there are at least 4 or 5 squads up there, probably more." He pointed backwards with his thumb. Lelibran absorbed the information for a moment and nodded. He took a long drink from a canteen, and taking back his swords, he started back to the battle, nodding to the sentry in the tree, who finally managed to reload his crossbows. And that is the end of that chapter. So, and that is as far as I'm going to go tonight. The next chapter is fairly short, another 12 pages, then 19 is another 12 pages. They're all pretty consistent. So we'll probably do 2 more, and then we'll finish up the book the week after that, because there will be 1 chapter and the epilogue. So, all right. Lots and lots of battle that time. Let's see. Who is around? Anybody? Vesper is playing retro, because that's what Vesper does. Mr. Blitzer is playing Yakuza Kiwami. Mikachu is playing Dead by Daylight. I just don't get the appeal of that game. It's just not something that interests me even in the slightest. So, well, I have been to retros, Vespers, more recently. So I'm going to go on over to Mr. Blitzer. So I will see you on over there. Stick with me for just a couple minutes.
Calling to say I